Hello, I'm Dr. Mark Landahl. I'm an adjunct professor with Frederick Community College in the Mid-Atlantic Center for Emergency Management and Public Safety. Today, what we hope to do is provide sort of an overview of a series of interviews to come that will delve deeper into issues for intelligence at the federal, state, local, and also in the private sector. And we're looking at that with an eye toward prevention. Now, my background, I have an academic background in emergency management and homeland security, as well as I'm a recently retired law enforcement commander who was the Homeland Security commander for a law enforcement agency in the state of Maryland. I also am currently an emergency manager housed in the police department in the city of Rockville. So my background in that is provides some at least local and state views. And then with this, we'll try and provide the context for the other interviews that will follow. So when we look at intelligence, intelligence sort of falls in our homeland security mission areas in the prevention area. So we're looking at how do we prevent things from happening, and that's where intelligence comes in. And it's laid out in our planning frameworks in the National Prevention Framework, which includes things of intelligence and information sharing, screening, search and detection, interdiction and disruption, forensics and attribution, and public information and warning, which we'll talk about, and operational coordination for intelligence, which obviously we've seen at points in our history is challenging, whether it be 9/11 or even as recent as the January 6th incident at the Capitol. So we'll work from a definition of intelligence. The Office of the National Director of National Intelligence has that intelligence is information gathered within or outside the U.S. that involves threats to its nations, threats to our nation, its people, property, or interests, development, proliferation, or use of weapons of mass destruction, and any other matter bearing on the U.S. national or homeland security. Intelligence can provide insights not available elsewhere that warn of potential threats and opportunities, assess probable outcomes of proposed policy options, provide leadership profiles on foreign officials, and inform official travelers of counterintelligence and security threats. So this, of course, is a federal-centric definition, but if you take that and apply that and see what policy options at the state level or at the local level or even at the corporate level and see how intelligence provides that component. So when we talk about that, we're going to use, again, Fed-centric approach in the National Intelligence Strategy, but also if you sub through and you see how this would affect down to corporate levels or a law enforcement CEO or a mayor of a major city or a county executive of a large county. So when we look at the mission of intelligence, there's a couple of levels, and we're looking at their strategic intelligence. So that would be issues of enduring national security interest, things that are long-term. Then there's anticipatory intelligence. So it addresses new and emerging trends, changing conditions, and underappreciated developments. Now, you can also see how a CEO might be very interested in anticipatory intelligence. And then finally, current operations intelligence that supports planned and ongoing operations. And that's where we see a lot of the focus of intelligence in general is on supporting current operations. So those missions outlined in the National Intelligence Strategy, then from, again, a federal-centric approach, go into the areas of cyber threat intelligence. So what do we know about that component? Counterterrorism, again, just one leg of the things that we need to know at a national level, and also that intelligence needs to be providing us with good policy options and also that awareness of the current state of affairs. Counterproliferation, again, that would be weapons of mass destruction and making sure that they do not extend or fall into the hands of those that may do harm with them. And then also counterintelligence and security. So that's where we look at threats from foreign intelligence entities and insiders. And that's even when we get into the business community and we talk about industrial espionage and other things of that nature that may not be on a national level, but again, on a corporate level. And then some of those businesses and major, if there are issues with major businesses, that can then affect, of course, our national security as well. So intelligence, when we talk about it, there's a cycle that produces it. So when we look and say the intelligence community is responsible for supplying accurate and usable information to those who make national security decisions, generating reliable, accurate intelligence is an active and never-ending process. It starts with planning. And with that, it's what do we need to know? Policymakers, what do the president, what does, and if we take that down to a local or state level, what does a governor need to know? What does a mayor need to know? What are the things that need to be informed by intelligence? Once we know those goals, overall items that are needed, then it moves into collecting items in order to have information to then take through and process to become intelligence. So there's 6 basic types of intelligence collection, and that's signals intelligence, imagery intelligence, measurements and signature intelligence, human source intelligence, open source intelligence, and geospatial intelligence. So those, of course, when we look at our intelligence community, some of those have homes in different, for the most part, in different agencies, even though all may do some portion of them. But also you can look at this at, again, state and local level, where there may not be signals intelligence going on in certain degrees, but there's a lot of human source or open source that are used to make sure that those strategic surprises do not come. Once there's a collection of information, then it is processed, and that's where you take the raw intelligence and raw information and turn it into something that's usable. That's where imagery is exploited, messages may be decoded, telemetry may be reduced to meaningful measures, and that's where those things go to be processed and also able to be retrieved. So then the process moves into analysis, and that's where it's taking all of that information that's been processed so that it's usable, and then integrating, evaluating, analyzing all of that available data, and then distilling it into final intelligence products. The last piece of it is dissemination. So that's where, again, whether things are at different levels of classification, but that it gets into the hands of the decision makers, and it gets into the hands of the operational commanders, where if we're talking about that tactical intelligence, that makes a difference for people that may be in the field at a location that they are. What do they need to know to inform their operations? So the intelligence community had another member added to it in the U.S. Space Force. The previous to that was 2019. Previous to that, the only addition to the intelligence community came when the Department of Homeland Security was formed and integrated into the intelligence community. The Office of the Director of National Intelligence came with the Intelligence Reform and Prevention Act. That office has not always been there, so there are still some learning curves and some changes and some institutionalization that's coming along with that position as well. But basically, if you include the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, you've got 18 components of our U.S. intelligence community from the federal perspective. So what we'll do is take a quick breeze through those. They're grouped, not necessarily in the way their group could be argued, let's just say. So if we look, we have our National Defense Intelligence Cluster, and this is how I've done it with the Defense Intelligence Agency, with their major focus on measurement and signature intelligence. And then, of course, we have our branches, traditional branches of the armed forces, and including now the U.S. Space Force, also include the Coast Guard, but the Coast Guard also has a law enforcement role, which I've grouped it in there. Also within that Defense Intelligence Cluster, we have geospatial intelligence through the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, the National Security Agency with a heavy emphasis on signals intelligence, and then also the National Reconnaissance Office focused on imagery intelligence at the federal level. As we move, we also get civilian, international, and law enforcement components of the intelligence community. Our U.S. Civilian International, with a heavy focus, obviously, on human source intelligence, is the Central Intelligence Agency. And then the State Department is also heavily involved in that component as well. And if we look at, of course, there are international components of these as well with the Justice Department and the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the Department of Homeland Security, Department of the Treasury, U.S. Coast Guard. Again, Coast Guard could also be put in the military component, and the Department of Energy. Some folks will say, why the Department of Energy? Huge focus on counterproliferation when we look at the nuclear component and the intelligence associated with making sure that nuclear materials do not end up in the hands of those that will do harm. So looking at that, those are our, again, some clusters of the intelligence community and how they fall. Also, finally, the DEA, huge component of that, whether it would be just in general for flow of narcotics, but also things such as narco-terrorism and along those lines as well. So just a quick breeze through our intelligence community, and then tying that down, we're going to move from federal down into state and local. But the DNI also has clusters or centers where they pull things together. So there's the National Counterterrorism Center, which obviously across all of those agencies of the intelligence community, those things are fused for terrorism at the National Counterterrorism Center. The Cyber Threat Intelligence Integration Center, National Counterproliferation Center, and then other support components of the intelligence community being the National Intelligence Council, the Intelligence Advanced Research Projects Activity, and then the National Counterintelligence and Security Center. So you can see those components that we had in the list being cyber, being terrorism, being counterproliferation, and counterintelligence as centers within the intelligence community to make sure that those things are fused across all of the agencies that are doing intelligence work at the federal level. So when we talk about products and products being coming out even to the general public, we look at the example of the National Terrorism Advisory Center, the last or advisory system, excuse me. The last bulletin that was put out in November as a summary of the terrorism threat to the homeland, and that's an example of a terrorism, or excuse me, a product. This one focused on counterterrorism that makes its way from the intelligence community to something that's already out to all the way out to the general public in the United States to say, here is the current threat picture, and here's what you can do about it, or here's what you should be concerned about. So this ties into our national preparedness goal of doing public information and warning from a pre-event and from a prevention perspective. So when we look and we start saying, well, how do we tie in, and how to federal, state, local, tribal partners pull in together? And this from a document that's the Domestic Approach to National Intelligence, came out of the Office of the Director of National Intelligence Office in 2019, I believe, but talks about how criminal intelligence, as you can see on the right, and Homeland Security information, investigative information, cyber threat, and the passing back and forth between those items, which are important to inform. Not only is it a federal, we don't look at it as a federal top-down approach, while the federal government has a large budget and has a lot of significant resources focused on that state and locals do not. State and locals have, and tribals have people on the ground. And then when things are being seen at the local level by police officers doing their jobs, EMS providers, firefighters, whatever those things may be, of those suspicious activity reports and other things that may tie to things that have been developed by the IC. And that's where that's important, that exchange comes down of that information and that flow and how they move through things. For an example, here we're at Frederick Community College, so just using a Frederick example, you have the Maryland Coordination and Analysis Center, which is our state fusion center. So that's the sharing of intelligence information with law enforcement, public health, and emergency responders, and the private sector as well, where information comes from those entities and goes up to the Maryland Coordination and Analysis Center and also flows back down. But it's where, when we're in Frederick, all of the police departments, for example, that Maryland State Police, the Frederick County Sheriff's Office, the Frederick Police, the Brunswick Police Department, Thurmont Police Department, and Mount Airy Police have a conduit for information to flow from a town up to the state, and then that fusion center being a point that meets with the federal government as well, which those being a joint operation between state, local, tribal, and federal, so that information can flow, whether that be the suspicious activity information coming up from law enforcement or things that are coming down from the intelligence community that are important for responders to know. Now, when we talk about the private sector, and that's where it's very interesting, because we know that there's competition among companies in the various sectors, but it's also very important that these companies that may be competitors in certain ways also have similar threats affecting them. So when we look, the National Infrastructure Protection Plan first laid out the critical information sharing framework, and through that being for information sharing and analysis centers in various groups, like the auto ISAC you see up in the far left, and you see some of these, the maritime ISAC, these other things, water ISAC. It's very important that water utilities and others, they have a way to share information that is specific to their sector. And these are ways that can be encouraged to get information from the federal government, and from even then inside those specific industry groups, back up to the federal government, and back as we have a flow of information, so that everyone can stay safe from the threats. And when threats are identified, they're pushed up into the pipeline to be recognized and see, again, if they can be mitigated at the federal level, perhaps, or maybe even they're mitigated at the local level, or they're handled within an ISAC. So there's multiple structures when we talk about the federal intelligence community. We talk about the state level fusion and major metropolitan fusion center network. And then we look at the private sector components that come together through this threat information sharing framework, that all of these things are tied together and things don't necessarily, or say proverbially, fall through the cracks. So just an example that came from that same document is attack at the Westgate Mall in Nairobi, Kenya, and how information flowed here, just as an example, because that obviously was an attack at a commercial facility in Kenya. It was an attack by Al-Shabaab, and you can see on the left that the State Department, as we talked about as part of the IC, coordinated that initial information sharing and teleconference, got that information to the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security, where they put together a joint intelligence bulletin. And then the FBI conducted threat briefings. They shared via InfraGard to the private sector, shared via conference calls, and then also the Department of Homeland Security through its protective security advisors disseminated information, that joint information bulletin, and all of that went to owners and operators of similar commercial facilities as a threat matrix. And then those owner and operators, of course, then provide information back. You see that also on the right, the Department of Homeland Security, Federal Bureau of Investigation, and others provide security outreach and training and other things, and that information flow goes through there, where that threat information and the intelligence flow through to make sure that it gets into the hands of those who need it. So hopefully with this, we've gotten sort of a place to start, or a higher level overview of intelligence of the federal, state, local, and private sector, and how that information will come together as we do future interviews and talk with people that are working currently in these fields and working and doing things within these structures for intelligence, whether that be, again, to inform a mayor, to inform a county executive, to inform a governor, to inform the President of the United States. So thank you for joining me, and I will wrap up here.